everyone, and welcome to episode 103 of the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. Now, first off, I'd just like to thank BP and Gordo for hosting last week's podcast while I was on leave. They've done a fantastic job. I was a little bit nervous that I may not get my job back after the performance they've both put in. So again, thanks very much. They did a great job with the Q&O. It seems to be a very popular topic, so we'll certainly keep those coming through in the future. Today I wanted to talk about strategy and planning. You'll have heard me speak about that a lot during the podcast. And that doesn't really matter whether you're buying or selling property or whether it's a home or an investment. Planning out the process and putting in a strategy to implement that are really important parts to that. And we recently had an example of a vendor advisory job where that really came to the fore, and the planning and the strategy that we implemented during that campaign really showed its benefits come the conclusion. So the client at the time came to us wanting to sell an investment property that they'd purchased some 25 odd years ago. It had been without our assistance, but it had certainly served its purpose for them, given them some really good levels of capital growth. But they'd reached a certain time where they no longer required that property and decided that it was time to sell it. So I wanted to go through the strategy that we implemented and how the planning involved with that really benefited the client and why it was so important, and how that played out during the campaign. So just to give some initial background and some context on this, the property was a two-storey house constructed around the 1930s in St Kilda, a very typical St Kilda type house. As I said, 25 years ago it was purchased, and at the time of purchase, so that 25 years ago, the renovation in the house was probably about 10 to 15 years old at that point in time. So as you can imagine, it had become, if no works had been done, it would have become quite dated by now. Since purchase, they had spent very minimal amounts of money. That had 3 tenants over that whole entire period. So people tended to move in there and stay put. It was quite sought after, and tenants really enjoyed living there. It was in a very central location for St Kilda. And the tenant that was in there at the time of inspection when I first went through the property had been there for coming up on 10 years at that point in time. So the initial discussions that the vendor had with me disclosed that the tenant had actually expressed an interest in purchasing the property, which, as we've said in the past, is not unusual. Tenants quite often grow attached, particularly if they've been there for that length of time. As most of you will know, we have a very, very particular process that we follow through with our vendor advisory service. And I'm not going to go through that step by step today because we'll be here all day if we do. But I wanted to review the important parts of how the planning and strategy in this campaign really came to the fore. So first off, the first step, as I said, was the investigation and that first inspection of the property. And certainly upon inspection, I came to the realization fairly quickly that there was going to need to be some money spent on the property. It really did need some work. The tenant that was there over the time had done a number of DIY works themselves. Now, majority of those had been carried out with landlord approval, but there were a few that they'd just taken their own initiative and decided that certain things needed to be done or that they wanted to enjoy the property for themselves. Not ideal, but that's what you work with. So during the inspection, what I wanted to get out of that was to determine the work that would need to be done if we were to take the property to market, how long that work is going to need to take to be done, so what sort of lead-in time we're going to need, the level of genuine interest that the tenant may or may not have. So was it something that perhaps the landlord didn't completely understand, or was it a genuine interest? How ready is the tenant to proceed with something? And what work had been carried out by the tenant during that time, and was it something that perhaps they would want to change back and therefore take with them, or is it things that they were perhaps just happy to leave there? Now, because of the features of this property, as I said, 1930s, and there was a heritage overlay on there, the works that were going to be done to the property were certainly going to add value, and they were going to definitely be beneficial to the sale campaign. So it was really important to get a clear understanding of what we wanted to do, and also to get a bit of an understanding as to cost, so that I could look at cost versus benefit in terms of what was worth doing and what wasn't. So the works that we looked at were fairly typical, but they were quite substantial because it was a reasonable size house. Painting throughout, internally and externally. Polished floorboards. The house was rendered, so painting the render was really important. Polished floorboards, replaced carpets. We needed to get a handyman through to do a lot of little different things like realigning cupboard doors in kitchens and robes, some grouting, handyman type work all over the property. Gardening was quite significant, and had become quite overgrown, so there was a fair bit to do there. And obviously styling furniture once the tenant moved out, we would want to have it presented nicely. So we budgeted around a 4-week time frame to get all of that work done. A lot of it could be done in conjunction, but that was the sort of time frame that we thought we would need to allow. So my conversations with the tenant, well, they did express a genuine interest in purchasing the property. They really liked living there. They felt that they knew the property's faults, but that they could work with it and improve it in a manner that would make it livable for them. I found out that they didn't have finance approved at that point in time, and they also had another property that they would need to sell. So there's a few barriers and a few hoops that would need to be jumped through in order for them to be able to purchase a property. But one of the positives that came out of that discussion was, without any prompting or without any indications from me around what I was thinking value-wise, the figures that they were talking were certainly in excess of what I was thinking, and what the vendor was thinking. So it was something that was definitely worth pursuing at that point in time. And that's what, when I spoke to the vendor after having that inspection, was what I conveyed to them, that I was still very skeptical and wanted to make sure that we continued with other options, but that it was worth pursuing further. So the next step from there is to look at the planning and the strategy around that. So how are we going to implement things and what needs to be done? So the tenant still had a couple of months left on their lease. So that gave us a bit of time to get our planning and things organised, but it also meant that there was time to issue notices to vacate and things in terms of keeping the works going along. So I laid out a plan for our vendor, and that involved arranging a further meeting with the tenant to really nail down what our expectations would be, but also what they were looking for and whether or not they were going to be able to come through. I needed to determine their level of interest as part of that and what was their capacity going to be. I also needed to explain to them that we would be issuing a notice to vacate in order to keep things moving along. That didn't prevent them from purchasing the property, but what it did do was that if they weren't going to proceed with the purchase, that would enable us to still go through the full process of doing works. We needed to give them a bit of a timeline of when we would need to know what their level of interest was, so that it wasn't going to just go on and on and on. So if they did want to proceed, they needed to give us a clear answer by X date. Should they not proceed, then the notice to vacate should they want to proceed, then the notice to vacate becomes irrelevant. If they don't, then it stands. They need to move out by the notice to vacate date, and we can then move forward with the trades that would be needed to be done to get the works finished, and obviously to get the styling furniture in, property photographed, and then get the property up online in order for us to conduct the campaign in the window that we preferred for that property. So I met with the tenants. The next stage in this process was the negotiation with the tenants, and obviously the implementation of our strategy and our plan. So I met with the tenants. I clarified their position and what they were thinking on value. And unsurprisingly, the figure that they initially threw at me was higher than what they thought the second time round. Figures had certainly come back. That figure the second time round was below what my expectations were and what the vendor's expectations were. So things have already started to slip down expectation-wise. I explained that they were below expectations at the figures that they were discussing, and that the figures that they'd mentioned previously was more in line with what the vendor was looking for. I also explained that we wouldn't be looking at conditional offers, so subject to the successful sale of their other property or subject to finance, those types of things. We would need it to be unconditional, and that the other terms that would be involved. So what sort of settlement period, what sort of deposit would be required, and then obviously the time frame that they would need to come back to us by, so that it gave them plenty of time. It was well over 60 days if they were genuinely going to be interested. They had enough time to get themselves organised and sorted, but if they weren't, then it still gave us enough time to get our works and things done. So I left that with them, and unsurprisingly, within about a 4-week period of having that meeting, they came back and said, look, it's just not going to work. We can't work within those timeframes, and we don't see value at that level. So they decided not to proceed. The further thing that I needed to clarify with them, which we did, was around the works that they'd carried out. There were a couple of little things that initially they thought that they would like to take with them. And once I explained that that was fine, they were entitled to do that, but they would need to rectify and bring everything else that they'd done. There was some screens that they'd put up. And I said, well, you'll need to make good all of the works around that and perhaps patch and paint what you've done. They decided to leave things as they were. So that worked out well for everyone. So from there, we were able to, during that balance of the 4 weeks still remaining on the lease, we got quotes in. So we had a very clear understanding as to what was needed to be done. There were a few things that we decided against because it started to push the costings up to a certain level, which we didn't think was valid. So we got the works locked in though, and we had the trades ready to go basically a day or two after the tenants moved out. So that all worked in really well. The tenants moved out, the trades came in, we got all of the works done within about 3.5 weeks. We then had the styling done, which came up really well, and had the photography done. So the property presented immaculately. It was such a significant difference. The paint and the floorboards particularly made the property look really, really good. But one of the key factors was the garden. It really, for a St Kilda property, it had quite a substantial amount of garden, and it really came up quite well externally as well. So that was great. From a campaign perspective, as I said, it presented really well. We didn't, and it was the property was being sold. It was, as I said, it was a number of years ago. Was being sold in a time when the Melbourne market was still fairly flat. There wasn't a lot of activity around at that point in time. So we were getting reasonable numbers through the property. We weren't being overrun, but the quality was there. There were good quality buyers who met the profile of what we expected the buyer to be. They had genuine interest. And they were qualified, so they were ready to go. The agents that we were dealing with had dealt with a number of them before and knew that they were ready to move. So we weren't being overrun with quantity, but we were getting the quality through, which was good to see. Come our pre-auction meeting with the agents, we had 2 to 3 buyers that were making noises that they were interested in the property, that they would be there come auction day. However, they hadn't asked the right questions leading in to give us strong confidence that they would be seriously committed to buying the property. So we thought that they've got an interest, but they're not asking for settlement terms. They're not asking how they pay the deposit, those sorts of things, which usually give a sign that a buyer is quite committed to the property. So we had some concerns going into auction day, and they panned out to be the case. Come auction day, we had one genuine bid just above the bottom end of our quote price, and so we ended up passing the property in at that point. But that's when things really started to get interesting, which was good, because from there we had 2 parties who came through during the campaign and at that point in time had claimed that the property wasn't right for them when the agent had chased them up. And so that was things like the property didn't have any car parking, and for a family home that had put some people off. And for others, it was that perhaps the kitchens and bathrooms needed a bit more work than what they wanted to do. So they decided at that point, or they'd said at that point, it wasn't quite suitable for them. We had another party who'd said that they were intending to bid. And when we called, they said they might have some interest, but they'll come back on Monday to do that, when we typically have a follow-up inspection after the auction. And then we had one final party who saw it for the first time on the day of the auction, came through, liked the look of it, but said, look, it's a bit early. And then after the auction, gave us a $15,000 increase over the genuine bid that we'd had. So all of a sudden, we'd gone from being quite flat and thought that, oh, perhaps this isn't going so well, to thinking, okay, well, all of a sudden now we've got 3 or 4 people that are really showing some strong interest. And by the time we got to our Monday afternoon open for inspection, which is typical for a property that's passed in on a Saturday, we'd had 2 further parties put offers forward. We had another party who came for a second inspection, and we had another party who booked in a building inspection for Tuesday morning. So by the time we got to that Monday evening inspection, we had an offer at the midpoint of the quote price that we'd had. And then by the time we got to Tuesday afternoon after the building inspection, and with some back and forward with all of these 3 other parties that were interested, we'd now had an offer that was unconditional on a very short settlement at $25,000 above the top end of our quote price. So with the right strategy and with the right planning and with the right agent involved, we were able to go from a pretty flat auction to generating the right level of interest because of where we'd spent money and where we'd targeted it, to get 3 parties putting forward offers after that genuine offer on the day of the auction. We had 3 more parties getting involved, and we got an offer up above the top end of the quote. So needless to say, we had a vendor that was over the moon and really, really happy with the result because it was beyond what they were expecting, and certainly beyond what the tenant had started to tell us when on their second time around. So as you can see, what you need to do in these scenarios is you plan for the worst. So the worst case scenario for us was that the tenant wasn't going to be able to come through with this dream price at the start, and that we still had a plan of how we would move forward. But we were hoping and giving every opportunity for the tenant to come through and pay that price. So we didn't shut it down. We gave it every chance. We fed it. We tried to push it to a result that would give the vendor a really unbelievable outcome. However, when we could see that it was never going to be genuine, we went to our second option, which still gave us a really good result that the vendor was extremely happy with. So the plan that we put in place and then the strategy that came out of that gave us the result that we were after, which was a great outcome. So that's it for episode 103 of the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. As always, please feel free to share the podcast far and wide with friends, family, and share it on your social media if possible. If you'd like further information, please visit our website, wakeland.com.au. Otherwise, we wish you all the best with your property decisions.